Okay, Saba. All right. So let's get started. Welcome everyone to this month's IGRI Research Seminar Series. It's good to see you. Thank you for joining us virtually on this lovely day in upstate New York, at least. Hope it's nice where you are too. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Uta Brady. I'm a postdoc at Syracuse University, where I have the pleasure of collaborating with Saba Siddiqui on all kinds of interesting projects. I'm also the IGRI lab manager, which basically means if you have any questions or issues that are related to the IGRI Research Seminar Series, the IGRI listserv, the website, you can just shoot me an email. I'm here to help you. So before we get started with our presentation today, I do have some exciting news to share. IGRI will be launching its inaugural virtual conference this year. So that's really exciting news for us. The conference will take place from June 21st to the 23rd, and we have the time period of 11 to 2:30 p.m. Eastern set aside for the seminar on each of those dates. So we really hope that you will be able to join us. It's virtual, as I've already mentioned. So we are currently inviting research presentations that report on any methodological, theoretical, and/or empirical or case-specific applications of the institutional grammar. Registration and participation in the conference are free. Yay. That's always good. If you are interested in presenting your work, please submit your title and abstract by May 7th through the IGRI website. And we're going to add a link where you can hook up to more information on that in the chat. So let's get started with our presentation then. Today, we're welcoming Dr. Jacob Bauerbiere from Indiana University as our guest speaker. He obtained his joint political science public policy PhD at Indiana University and has since returned and is currently affiliated faculty with the Ostrom Workshop. And he's also working towards a master's degree in architecture and design. So that's quite an impressive academic trajectory there, Jacob. Kudos to you. Today, Jacob will be presenting on his work using the institutional grammar to explore social justice and economic deservingness issues and their behavioral implications. So please join me in welcoming Jacob. And Jacob, the audience is yours.
Cool, thank you for that introduction, Uta. And I'm not sure when regressing in one's degrees was an impressive accomplishment, but I'll take it. For those of you considering a master's degree in architecture, don't do it. Today we'll talk about what we deserve, or rather what we think we deserve. And I think this is actually of some relevance to people who use the institutional grammar. And, I'm going to present this as kind of like a seamless thing, as if the institutional grammar just fits right in. But it took me forever to figure out that it was kind of a crucial thing to think about. And I'm not totally certain that it ports perfectly. And I'm happy to take some kickback on that. And I'm happy to talk about that. And I'm also happy to take clarifying questions in the classic workshop tradition. So I don't know if you guys, if you don't want to just interrupt me, which you should feel free to, I guess if you want to text Uta or Saba and they can interrupt me with your questions. But we'll get started. And I will point out that the last time I gave this talk, it was the 100th anniversary of Piet Mondrian's death. And I was in Amsterdam at the time, so that's the color scheme. And I probably spent more time on it than I did double checking my regression results. So, okay. We are in a new Gilded Age. Inequality is at levels and now has surpassed levels that we hadn't seen since the 1920s, at least in America. And it's a global phenomenon. No European country is immune to this, however enlightened they may seem. And the question is, well, we know what it does. We know what this does. It has effects on consumption, it has effects on our productivity, and we're believing it has increasing effects on our democracy. But I'm not yet convinced that we've done a great job explaining this inequality, especially in America, where we've got a fairly egalitarian strain. In fact, recent research shows that even diehard conservatives and Republicans want a fairly level economic field, and they think outcomes are far too skewed. And some people would argue that, in fact, people are deluded or crazy. So, for example, you get these seemingly conflicting opinions. Over 50% of people say income differences are too large. And they also say that there are strong conflicts between the rich and the poor. And they also say that the government shouldn't do anything about it. You know, that we shouldn't be fixing this, that we don't actually need to fix this income gap. And so my clicker's not working now. And so I'll click, okay, yeah. And so dominant explanations are as follows. People are just confused. It's kind of the Bartels argument. They're just stupid. The psychologists would argue that there's a delusional quality going on, that people are just, they have to convince themselves that the world is just, and so they'll accept whatever the outcome is as just. And then the kind of more popular one that you read about in like the New York Times and Washington Post is that people are greedy, and they just think that they're going to be on the top one day. And I've got some stuff at the end if we want to talk about it that will disprove all of this, or at least show that none of these are totally satisfactory responses. I argue that we need to be considering that some people think that this is just a just situation, that it is a situation that accords with their definition of moral correctness, and that for that reason, they've got no incentive to change it, even if it would materially benefit them. And largely that's because, well, it's because justice is a social institution. So my thesis, people will tolerate inequalities if those inequalities are deserved. Why? Because doing otherwise would cost them. And that's because justice is a natural phenomenon. I argue that it is the product of repeated human interaction solving multiple equilibria problems, which is what all social institutions are. And if that's true, then it means that violating kind of your community's idea about who deserves what and why, you know, if you argue against that, that's going to have costs to you. People are going to shame you, or you're going to feel an internal shame about that. So just to review, I think everyone here probably knows this, what an institution is. If you do some action and somebody sees it, they're going to, you know, chastise you for that. It's an external delta parameter. And that happens often enough, eventually you will start to chastise yourself. If you're considering picking your nose, no, you're going to freak yourself out and be like, no, I can't do that. You know, my mom told me enough that I can't do that. Now we have these stories, you know, and we have parables and morals and fables and all these things that essentially are communicating what I argue are institutions. What then is justice, desert, and redistribution if we're believing that justice is a natural phenomenon? Well, justice is very simple. It's just getting what someone deserves. It's that simple. That just kicks the can down the road, though. Because what desert is it means you have to merit some outcome or treatment or responsibility. And so redistribution would be correcting outcomes that are undeserved. This all seems very pat and kind of nice and simple, except that desert's going to become very complicated because it's going to be emerging. Different groups, different communities are going to come to different ideas about who deserves what and why, sometimes for no good reason at all. You know, they're going to be trying to deal with a responsibility or some sort of material good, and how do we distribute it? Chores are a great example. You know, what in one culture might be women's work and another culture is not necessarily because there's any biological basis for who does what, but because patterns get solidified as people try to adjudicate burdens and responsibilities. And these become entrenched and take on a moral quality for reasons that have a lot to do with the institutional grammar. However, okay, so if desert is emergent and widely variable, then what this means for policy scholars is that we need to get back to our ethnographic roots, because we need to figure out what people consider deserved and deserving of a given resource or outcome or institution, responsibility. So for example, and this is going to get tricky, this is why we need good ethnographers, is because let's say you're a Protestant. You know, Protestants tend to have a very clear-cut idea about what it means to deserve material wealth. And that has to do a lot with hard work. Okay, what if you're a Protestant who works in Silicon Valley? You know, there seems to be this emergent phenomenon in Silicon Valley where they don't care how hard you work. If you come up with a brilliant piece of code and you do it in one night, that also entitles you to you know, the benefits of that code, to the material benefits that might produce. So what happens if you're a Protestant programmer? You might have these conflicting, you know, impulses, and you might have external and internal delta parameters that are putting you at odds with people in your group. So we need some careful ethnography. And I'm not an ethnographer, but I hope some people in the audience are. So really quickly, desert. I will show that it can be translated into norms and rules and talk about what those costs might look like. So for example, a very simple desert statement, they only have 3 components: a subject, an object, and a basis. So, Ulysses in the bottom case is the subject deserving of something. The object he deserves is to be engulfed in eternal flame. And the basis of that is for using treachery, okay? And there's another example there with Lynn. These are very simple desert statements. Can they be translated into institutional statements? I argue they can, and I sent out a paper that does this like in extreme detail, and I'd be amazed if anybody got through it. But basically, I argue that these can all be translated to one another. And so, for example, if we have a desert statement that is, people who labor exceptionally hard deserve fantastic wealth, your desert bases would be, one, you have to be a human, you have to be a person. It's often an unstated basis. And you have to labor exceptionally hard. And then you deserve fantastic wealth. And I've translated that into it'd be a two-part institutional statement where you have a must and a may deontic. And then what it is hard to account for in desert statements is the condition that is in the IDECO framework, your attributes, deontic, et cetera, et cetera. And so, people in moral philosophy would call this just ordinary language philosophy. You don't need this as an extra category. I would just say you add a condition. And in this case, a desert statement might be only people who labor exceptionally hard deserve fantastic wealth. To translate that into an institutional statement, we just change our may to a must not. So people who do not labor exceptionally hard must not produce or possess fantastic wealth. And I've got a ton of these examples in the paper I sent out, and I don't really care to belabor it here, but here's the basic tool. Here's the basic kind of like how it translates. Your subjects and your bases get put into the attributes column for the IDECO framework. And your objects tend to be in the deontic and the aims brackets. And then your conditions, you just have to come up with a condition in kind of the ordinary moral philosophy. And then for your or else statement, that is actually a whole new desert statement. So if you violate this rule, if you don't deserve some outcome, then you deserve punishment. And there are rules for that. So the or else will signify, there'll be a whole nother desert basis and a whole nother institutional basis specifying the sanction. What do you deserve if you violate this just outcome? So I'm happy to talk about that. But what I'd rather, hold on. Sorry. Yeah, I'm getting ahead of myself. Here's the value of desert statements. The very idea of desert is that in the social sciences, if you try to keep up with the number of different kinds of justices we have, good luck, man. Like, there's redistributive justice, there's retributive justice, there's procedural justice. There's a million goddamn justices. And trying to figure them out it's too much. And we lose sight of what justice is. And we start using terms like fairness, and we start using terms like fair and warranted. Legal scholars have invented whole new words for this. And I think they all make us lose sight of the very simple definition of justice, going back to Aristotle and Mill, which is getting what you deserve. And so what's cool about desert is it actually unifies the different kind of standard distributional principles of need, equity, and equality. You can frame all of these things in a simple desert statement. And you actually find out when you do that what is often what you might believe is a need statement or an equality statement or an equity statement, they're interchangeable. What might appear to be equity might also be phrased as equality. So for example, the equal vote. All men and women get one vote. They're equal in that regard. That's also an equity statement too, because we tend to look at citizenship and humanness as binary variables. If we're all equal in our humanness and citizenship status, we are all equal for a vote. So the difference between equity and need and equality, they kind of disappear when you start to look at things as simple desert statements. And the differences are kind of illusory. I and actually several other philosophers have argued, and I can give you links to that. And it also unifies distributive and procedural justice. They're just two sides of the same coin. Distributive justice is determining what is the proper desert basis. And procedural justice, which is often used, the term fairness is often used in its place, it's just how do we make sure that the object is delivered to the subject? So these all kind of come together in a very simple concept of desert. And I think that's important. We're losing sight, I think, of what justice is. So now the question is, does this do anything for us? Is there any leverage that we can gain as social scientists with this, return to a very simple idea of justice and a very complex idea of desert? And I'm going to give you just a couple behavioral findings that I think might be of interest. And they have to do with popular definitions of desert, which go back to Aristotle. So we have to contend with Aristotle always. He always beats us to it. We're going to look at the popular belief in its reward. Do Americans believe that people get what they deserved? And do these two things, the definition of desert in America, specifically when it comes to the economic outcomes, And does belief in its reward, that is justice, do they actually affect policy preferences when it comes to redistribution? And they do, is the short. So really quickly, let's talk about whether or not, it's like definitions of desert. I'm going to do a very simple one, right? And that is, do people believe that you need to be personally responsible for some economic outcome to deserve that outcome? And it turns out that's not as clear cut as economists like to think. In fact, economists often use the definition of personal responsibility as a synonym for just outcomes. And it turns out people don't agree on that. So really quickly, retributivism is this idea that control or personal responsibility is central to the, control is central to the idea of personal responsibility, that you are an agent and you have authorship over your actions. And then responsibility is central to desert. To deserve something, you need to be that agent. You have control over it. So retributivism is kind of the dominant idea of deservingness. It's philosophically underspecified, but it's very appealing. And people in law deal with this idea quite a bit. And economists tend to assume that this is what people think deservingness is, that you have to earn what you get. So I asked 1,000 people in America about 15 different factors. You can see them arrayed below. And I asked them, how much control do you think you have over that? And how important would it be to your ideal, in your ideal society, in your idea of an ideal society, how important would that quality be in determining people's economic outcome and their livelihoods? And you can see that it's, there's definitely some correlations here, but they're not always as obvious as you might want. In future work, I'd suggest that anybody who follows me up on this, or if I did again, I try to weight these by saliency. But let's look at some of the correlations. In my papers, I actually change all these graphs to heat maps so you can actually see how they travel together. So these are obviously not correlations I'm showing. What I'm actually showing is what you'll see the line in red is the ideal importance, people's ideal importance over it, and the blue is control over. So if it's to the right of that middle line, so for example, ambition, people's idea of control over it and their ideal importance of it correlate about 0.43. So it's a very moderate correlation. But the right is, ideal importance. So pretty much everyone agrees. Everyone's to the right of that line, that middle line, which means pretty much everyone agrees that it should matter to some degree. It should be important to our economic standing. But you can see that there are some people who on the blue line who fall to the left of that line, who don't think we have really control over our ambition. And so that's kind of how you interpret these graphs. So here's one where generally Americans agree on ambition, hard work, attitude, and education, that these things should be important to our economic standing and that we do have control over them. The same is true for race, family wealth, family connections, and gender. They think that these should not be important. Although obviously some people really suck. Like right here, you can see that some people do think that maybe race should matter. And some people think maybe gender should matter to our economic well-being. I don't know how to account for these people, but people think these things. And you can see that even here, they don't correlate all that strongly. They're all at best a moderate correlation in people's responses. The fun ones, though, are like the prestige of your schooling and health, where people disagree broadly, both on should this be important in my ideal society, and do you have any control over it? So this is, school prestige and health. People are at odds with themselves and one another over these questions. And then, of course, you get creativity and intelligence, where people think both these things should matter to your economic well-being. But a lot of people do not think that you have any control over your creativity or your intelligence. So if you are over here on intelligence and you think, yes, this should matter, but you're also over here on the question of control, then clearly the idea of personal responsibility is not that crucial to your definition of economic desert. And then there are a couple more of these. I'm not going to belabor them. But here's what the final outcome. When you put all these things and correlate them together and come up with a single kind of correlation of ideal importance and control for individuals, you get this distribution. And I then ran some analyses to see, what predicts this, and age, race, and income all predict this a little bit. The big one is, how important do you think economic growth is? Which, is kind of like a neoliberal kind of outlook. And so actually the number one determinant factor, it's about 0.1 on your correlation. So about 10% of your belief in that correlation between control over and importance of a factor is are you a neoliberal? Do you think that growth is more important than anything else? If you put a lot of emphasis on growth, then your definition of economic deservingness doesn't have much to do with your control over your attributes. It has to do with, are you delivering a good to the market that people want? So their definition of desert is, do you give people what they want? So that's just again, so this is kind of over 1,000 Americans. Here's the general distribution in terms of a definition. And this is, again, is a very shallow definition of desert. I fully expect that if we were to investigate this thing with qualitative research, we'd find that African Americans have a very interesting and unique definition of desert, and immigrants. And, we really need to start digging into, I think, what these different groups have as definitions of desert. Religions are going to be another big one. Actually, neuroscientists are constantly publishing papers about where they think they're being really clever and showing, look at these very religious people. They're the least likely to share, in this experiment, or they're like the least willing to divvy up resources with people from other religions. And it's like, yeah, because religions often have a desert statement that says you need to be a part of this religion or a part of this country to get anything. So, neuroscientists think they're being real clever and finding that people don't like to share things when they're on an out group. But it's like, no, that doesn't necessarily conflict with your religion. If your religion says only share it with other good members of the faithful community. So anyway, we need good ethnographers. All right. The second rule is, do people even think they get what they deserve? So if you think that people get what they deserve, then you believe the system is just, or is acting justly. It is delivering the objects that people deserve to those people. So I have 3 measures for this. An assessment. Do you think people are deserving of their economic status or not in America? How confident are you in that assessment? And how deserving are they? Now, this last one, this question of magnitude of deservingness, it's a bit like asking how poisonous is something. If poison is fatal, it's fatal. To say that this fatal poison is more poisonous than this fatal poison is something that we do say, but it's kind of meaningless at some point. So this question of, are you more or less deserving? A lot of philosophers would argue this is a nonsensical statement. You're deserving or you're not. But I include this measure, and I actually, in the regressions I will show you, or if we want to talk about them, I've run it with both binary and also I've broken it out and multiplied it and weighted it with confidence and magnitude. So you get this bimodal distribution potentially, where people on the far right think that Americans, they're very confident that Americans are very deserving of their economic status. So if you're poor, you deserve to be poor, and I'm very confident in that. If you're on the far left, you are not at all confident that people are not at all deserving. So I don't know if poor people do or do not deserve it. I'm very confident that they do not deserve to be poor, for example. And then you get people in the middle who are neither confident nor are they willing to say whether or not people are deserving. If this is confusing, I could slow down and re-explain it. But so you get, are they deserving or not, how confident, and how deserving. And you've got these various weights. When you look at things in just kind of an average, it looks like Americans are quite sympathetic to poor people. That your average American on average does not think that, say, poor people deserve their poverty in America. They think that something's wrong. Poor people are not getting the outcome they deserve. And on average, they kind of think that if you're in the middle class in America, yeah, that's about right. They kind of have a zero mean deservingness assessment. They don't really have an opinion. And same for the rich. It seems like they're kind of ambivalent about these two groups. Until you break it out and actually look at the distribution of results, and you find that no, there's actually a great deal of disagreement. So first we'll look at, the poor. So the majority of people think that poor people do not deserve to be poor. They're on the left side here. There's a great deal of debate over whether people in the middle of the income distribution deserve that middle income distribution. And I don't know if these people think they should have more or less. I just know that there is disagreement. People seem to fall into one or another category about, do people deserve their middling incomes? And wealth, it's damn near 50-50. There are a lot of people are very convinced that they do, and very convinced that they do not deserve their wealth. And then I run regressions to see, can we explain these differences? And ideology matters, education matters. We can talk about these findings if you want. This is just a teaser. So for example, ideology matters as to whether you think the poor deserve their poverty in America. But I'm going to take these two variables and jump ahead to this policy question of redistribution. And I'm going to show that justice is not as friendly an idea as people want it to be. That if you think calling for justice, economic justice, means that people are going to want a more equitable distribution or a more equal distribution, it does not mean that at all. So a double-edged sword. So I'm returning us back to the beginning of the talk. There's this incongruent public opinion. people seem to be confused or stupid. And I'm arguing that they're not. So if you look at the data, this is about the Bush tax cuts. Very few people thought that the Bush tax cuts were going to benefit them. And very few people thought that the average taxpayer would benefit from the Bush tax cuts. And everybody pretty much knew that those tax cuts were going to benefit the wealthy. And yet they still supported them. Why? Well, I argue it's all these reasons. These are well known in the economics literature. People care about their personal consumption. They care about the effects that inequality has on production. For example, if you're wealthy, you want inequality a little bit because that motivates your employees to work harder. And then there is this idea of fairness and effort. I'm saying get rid of that and let's talk about definitions of desert and belief in its desert's reward. So again, that's this question about control. That's that graph I showed you in the first section. How important is personal responsibility to your definition of desert? And then, do you think people get what they deserve in America? Do poor people deserve their poverty? Do rich people deserve their wealth? Those are my two variables of interest. I've also included a couple other variables, ideology, whether or not you think government is helpful, the role that charity plays, and all these other kind of things that economics knows influences these things. And I add to that my two variables, definition, and then I have these in blue are different ways to tackle the idea of, do you believe that people are justly compensated? They get what they deserve. So one, I just measure this, do you have to work hard in America? Two, do people believe they get what they deserve broadly? And then I also break down and ask, do these different groups in America get what they deserve? And my dependent variables are, do you support progressive taxes? And do you think the government should fix these inequalities? Those are my two dependent variables. Here's what I find. Both definition of justice and your assessment of justice, your definition of desert and your assessment of desert's reward, which is justice, they matter, and they matter a great deal. So all these things are standardized 0 to 1. On the range of how much do you support progressive taxes, I've standardized everything. So it's 0 is I don't support it at all, and a 1 is I support it a lot. And these are the coefficients you get in my 1,000-person survey. As a randomly administered. I can show you the demographics if you like. It was a pretty well-run survey at a social sci internet panel. All these achieve not just high statistical significance, but a high magnitude. It matters how you define. It matters how you define desert, and here's why. If you believe that deservingness economically is earning what you have, then allowing the government to intervene and redistribute those things makes you definitionally undeserving of that wealth you now have. So in this quirky sense, a lot of these people actually want a flatter distribution, but their definition prohibits government from being the one to do that because that's a third party and you have to be personally responsible for your wealth. So policy people should care about this because the definition of desert, the importance of personal responsibility to your outcome, affects the policy avenues open to government to correct that inequality. And then also there's this question of, do you even believe, is there something wrong that needs redistribution? Because if people get what they deserve, then there's no need to redistribute in the first place. And here we see that, in fact, it matters, your assessment of deservingness. And it matters both ways. So if you think people get what they deserve, and you think the system is just and delivering the right things to the right people, then if I'm a social justice warrior and saying we need to redistribute, people are going to say, yes, I agree with your call for justice, but my definition of justice and understanding of justice says that we don't need to redistribute. Things are already as they should be. And we can go through and break this down by some different variables and demographics. When it comes to taxes, things are a little bit different. The definition doesn't seem to affect your support for progressive taxation, but your assessment of justice, your assessment of the delivery of economic objects to deserving subjects does matter for how much you support progressive taxation. And so again, if you're calling for justice, if you think that calling for justice means, as a lot of people seem to, that we need a more equitable distribution of resources, these results show that, in fact, no, people are going to hear that call for justice and they're going to say, correct, I agree. We want the system to be just. That means we're not going to have progressive taxes because the system is already just. And again, we can break those apart. I also run some interactions and I get some mixed findings, so I'll not talk about those. I have a long appendix in the paper I sent out, if anybody wants to talk about that, with the conclusions. The importance of personal responsibility to definitions of economic desert or deservingness limits policy options available to us. And so we need to have a more robust understanding of what it means to deserve different things. We can't just ask, do people deserve this or not? I think we need to start asking different groups what it means to deserve the responsibility of the presidency, this or that economic outcome. Also, belief in desert's reward drives policy preferences. And actually, so in my findings, the deservingness of the wealthy was especially important. You can see that coefficient is especially high. So people seem to be thinking mostly about the wealthy when they're thinking about redistribution, not so much middle income or poor people relatively. So our assessment of wealthy deservingness is especially important. And citizens are they're not necessarily conflicted or irrational when they're saying these things. You can want a broader distribution of economic goods. You can want that egalitarianism when it comes to the economy. And you can also believe that there's no good way for government, no just way for government to be a part of that redistribution, even if it benefits you. If it's contrary to your definition of justice, you're in a hard place to come up with a policy that will do that. The implications are, one, that justice is crucial to our understanding of inequality, and that you should not count on justice absent a definition of desert to reduce inequality. We need to, people are going to be arguing, if you're arguing about justice, people are going to be talking against one another. We need to be talking about desert bases. And with that, I'll shut up and we can jump to whatever section anybody wants. And I'll stop sharing unless people want to see a graph.
Kimberly?
Oh, no, I was just
Oh, I'm sorry. I thought you had a question, but I'm seeing now that you're just clapping. Sorry.
Thank you, Kimberly.
Angelo?
Hi, great presentation. My name is Angelo, master's student at Syracuse University. I think, yeah, there's a lot of information here, and I think it's really difficult because you only have so much time, and you have to kind of balance, like, okay, like here's all this like theoretical stuff. But, like,
I didn't balance too well. Yeah, I'm sorry. Yeah,
and it's fine. I think I'd be curious to kind of go back though towards kind of maybe the story of how you saw like institutional grammar and how it links to this. And also, like, I would love to hear kind of like a little more of what you mean of using institutional grammar in like creating kind of like this grammar of like deserving, and almost like also where to move forward with this like grammar of deserving, right? Are you advocating maybe for ethnographic research of people utilizing this grammar of deserving, or is it like looking at policy documents and looking at how people like deserve things through policy? Like, what is your kind of take on those two things?
Yeah, great question. Yeah, and thanks for asking that, Angelo. Yeah, let me think about that. There's a phenomenon if you ever read the History and Philosophy of Science, which is it's a disappearing department. There's only like 8 departments left in the country. What you learn is that, how academics present a problem and how we actually arrived at an answer or a particular way of looking at it, they're totally different from one another. Like Schrodinger's explanation of how he came up with his equations have nothing to do with how he actually came up with them. So I don't know I don't remember how I came into this or what the thought process was. But the reason I know that the institutional grammar is important is because things in policy become, and even just not policy, let's break it down to a much simpler thing, just like how people interact with one another in family settings. There's like a recursive element to it. There's this kind of Doug Hofstadter loop. There's this strange loop effect that happens where, at least my understanding of the institutional grammar is very much that, okay, you have this statement, and in that institutional statement, there's an or else clause. But in common language, that or else clause is, people deserve this. And it's not always clear what or else, what is the punishment? What comes of this? And in fact, there's another desert statement that, okay, people who work hard deserve this, okay? And people who don't work hard, what do they deserve? And then, so you need this additional statement, right? And people who don't work hard but get money, who get ahead, what do they deserve, right? And then, so there's this additional clause. And all these things, I think, are expressed in common, ordinary language, which is a robust area in philosophy, but it's not well, as far as I know, represented in sociology or public affairs. And so what I'm kind of asking is, I think we need to go do, ethnography and see, like, how do people in a family, who gets to cut the Thanksgiving turkey? What does it mean to deserve that privilege? And what happens if somebody else steps in there? And what are all the attending and attending dessert statements that follow off that? Because they're there and they're understood, but they're not always spoken. And I think it's the same for policy implications. I don't think I explained that very well, but I hope it made some sense. And think of it not just, and the thing to keep in mind, the thing that I need to keep in mind, it's not just about the economy, right? It's about treatment. It's about responsibilities and burdens. We say commonly, what does it mean to deserve to be the president of the United States? And what does it mean to not be? We also say that some people are categorically undeserving. If you're not an American citizen and you're not above the age of 35, you don't qualify. Is that a desert statement, or is that it's an institutional statement for sure? So the two can be conflated. Not every institutional statement is a desert statement and vice versa. But I guess what I'm getting at is, I think we need to get back to our sociological roots and start better describing what is the linkage, because it's not a clear cut. There's never a clear cut institutional statement. Does that make sense? It's never one. There's a recursive element here.
It does. Thank you.
Thank God. I wasn't sure it was making sense.
Any other questions?
I have a question.
Asilata, Christopher had his hand up. Can he go first and then I'll call on you?
Sure, that's fine.
Okay, thanks.
Christopher.
Either way, Jacob, thanks for the talk. Really interesting, thought-provoking. So, my first obvious question would be, okay, what would be your policy suggestion for Biden right now, in order to facilitate redistribution? But that's not my question. You may want to respond if you want to afterwards. But the categories by which you that you used in your study in particular, asking about ambition, race, and different factors that basically allow people to signal desert in one way or another. Did you think about linking those in kind of value systems, or test them against different value systems, how those different categories relate and so on? Because there's quite a bit of studies on this one, right? So like word value studies and so on. So you could probably extrapolate whatever your findings you have already, on a global scale, and also cross-validate them with a second study. And I think you have all the material the way it sounds. It's just for you to establish this linkage. Is there any attempt or any direction, any thought in this direction you have entertained so far?
Yeah, so to your first question, I think it's relevant, and what I'd argue is that I keep getting emails from the DNC and the DSA saying, like, economic justice, and to them I'd say, people don't agree with you on what that means. You need to say what makes you deserving of these outcomes, because if you go around screaming justice, again, I cannot emphasize this enough, you're going to be working at a crossroads with people. When I get an email from the Democratic Socialists of America advocating for economic justice, were I to subscribe to an RNC email list, I'd be getting the same thing saying economic justice, and they're totally at odds with one another because the desert bases are different. For the DSA, you don't need to work hard necessarily. You just need to be an American citizen and a human to deserve an income, a good income. Those are the desert bases. To be an RNC person, you need to be, I'm not sure what you need to be for the Republicans to deserve anything. But so, I need to say, we need to start talking about, we need to have that culture war. Like, what does it mean to deserve this stuff? Stop saying it's just about justice. To your other question, I absolutely agree with you. And in fact, a lot of my dissertation was spent trying to convince people that this isn't just the same old kind of values survey. And in fact, what I argue we need to start doing is stop talking about these things as values, and let's start looking at the desert statements and the institutional statements, because these things are not just, are you a Protestant? Are you a Protestant whose family is going to look at you weird if you start saying, I don't think you need to work hard, or I'm going to go into Silicon Valley and program and I didn't have to work hard? Because then you're going to be facing different external costs. And so why talk about these things in this broad kind of you can extrapolate. You absolutely could say, well, Catholics tend to think this, Protestants tend to think this, people of the Muslim faith, and you could kind of try to do that. Or we could just go out there and do some field work and say, what do you think? What do you think about this scenario? Or I've actually done a lot of laboratory experiments, which I'd be happy to talk about at a future date, and show that people, it's crazy. People come up with these definitions kind of on the fly in the game. Like they will extrapolate and create new definitions of dessert in a game, which actually Ken Binmore discovered decades ago. Everything's already been done. But so no, I've not done that. But in fact, it's low-hanging fruit. It could easily be done. And what you'd be doing is you'd be extrapolating from this kind of very 1980s kind of research in political science about, essentially it's called the Protestant value or the Protestant ethic research program. You'd be extrapolating dessert statements from that. You could do that. I'd like to see us kind of go low level and try to figure out what these different groups, not what their values are. What is that dessert statement?
Asilata, you're next, and then Adam.
Yes, thank you. So fantastic presentation, Jacob. Very dense. I would like to read up more. I would like to read your paper again. My question is, one, could you go back to the slide where you had put the two halves, very deserving and personal responsibility? No. The pyramidal structure.
Pyramidal structure. Oh, this guy, yeah.
Yeah, this one. So one question is, could you explain what's going on here? And my other question is, are you suggesting an ideology institution link, that a certain ideology will help a certain institution to be better entrenched? And is this something policymakers should be cognizant of?
I'm going to answer your first question, then I'm going to ask you to clarify your second question. So this is just to show the various possible values that my measure could take. And remember, so that in this section, these values that you see along the bottom here, -1 to 1, they are a dependent variable. In that final section, these values are an independent variable. So first I try to explain, how can I explain the importance of personal responsibility to their definition of deservingness. And so this is a dependent variable. And then I use this variable then as an independent variable later. It would be a simple -1, 1, 0. So it'd be a binary variable that if you are very confident that a group is very undeserving of their outcome, you get a -1. If you get rid of those qualifiers of very, so very undeserving and very confident, and I just ask, do you think these people deserve or don't deserve the economic situation they have, you'd also get a -1. So we can treat it as a binary variable. And then I also just add these weights of magnitude, very undeserving, somewhat deserving, not especially deserving, and confidence, very confident, somewhat confident, not confident. So I just wanted to make sure I was very robust. When I was a graduate student, I was rather anal, and I wanted to make sure I had every measure possible when people would ask me this question. So I just cut this as a binary variable. It was -1 and 1, and then add in how confident are you in that assessment, and add in that magnitude thing. And so does that make sense? Is that sufficient?
Yes.
Okay, great. And now your follow-up question?
Yes, my second question is, are you suggesting that there is a link between ideologies and institutions? That are you saying that ideology can be leveraged to help institutionalize a certain policy, perhaps?
Interesting. I think that depends on how you're using the term ideology. For example, I was raised in a very liberal household. And my grandfather, who was very liberal, was raised in a very conservative household. So my grandfather, when he was on, as he was kind of beginning to have different policy opinions than his parents, they gave him shit for it. Okay, he got a lot of blowback for that, because he was in a conservative household. And so they, when they saw him having these opinions, so if you treat ideology as it is in America, and in many places now, as a brand, right? As a kind of, it's a community that you're in. And, we're all signaling. I wear my mask half the time outside just to signal. I'm a liberal. I'm on the side of science, and I'm part of a group. And so if you're talking about ideology in that way, then I'd say yes, because it's a community, and you're trying to signal to other community members. And if I didn't wear a mask and somebody of my liberal community saw me, that would weigh on me. That would make me feel bad.
Right.
Is that the kind of ideology you're talking about?
Yes, broadly speaking.
Yeah, so I just think of ideology in that regard as it's just another community that I exist in. And it will have its own, ramifications. And then there's a nested quality to all this, right? In my immediate neighborhood, where we're a little bit spaced out, I'm on a part of Indianapolis that's only sort of dense. If I'm walking down my street and I know everybody, I don't expect to get that blowback. So within my community, I might behave differently, even though I'm also existing in this larger community of Indianapolis, which is very liberal, in this
Right.
larger community of Indiana, which is increasingly conservative. So that nested quality is also important, and you get these cross-cutting.
That's very interesting. That's very interesting. Thank you. Thank you so much.
Okay, Adam.
Hi, Jacob. Thank you for this really awesome presentation. I read Michael Sandel's Tyranny of Merit last year, and this is bringing back flashbacks from those reflections. As someone who likes to think about dynamics and coupled infrastructure systems, it seems all good now. Yeah, so as someone who likes to think about dynamics and coupled infrastructure systems, I like to think about institutions themselves as a form of infrastructure that governs the flow of information in a system and material flows as well. And one of the cool things here is that I see you're trying to bring institutional grammar with statements of desert. But as I think Angelo brought up with his question, it seems like there's a chicken and the egg problem with institutions also contributing to some sort of lock-in effect of desert statements or pre-existing desert statements leading to certain creation or evolution of institutions within the system. So if you had to go about studying the evolution of desert statements or the dynamics of desert statements as emergent from some sort of institutional or infrastructural context, how would you go about doing
No, that's a brilliant question. It's a question, there's a couple of things. First of all, Michael Sandel. I got some things to say about the guy. We'll table that. Yes, I didn't. What I meant to say to Angela's question, you're right. I dropped the ball there. So two things. First of all, this moral quality that institutions take happens largely because of the deontic. That's partly why the institutional grammar is so important. This question of, may, must not, that's only one version of the deontic. As it's often expressed in common language, it's going to be shall not, must not, and should not. Should and should not are normative statements. Shall not. Shall and shall not carry kind of a biblical feel to them, right? Like there's, so there's going to be this moral weight, this normative weight imbued with institutions, largely because of that deontic and how it gets expressed in everyday scenarios. Add to that this evolutionary quality, which I would argue, what fascinates me the most is kind of the distance that people have from the thing that an institution is trying to regulate. And I'll give you an example, but there's a paper that's linked. I wrote it with a guy named Rohan Madamasetti, who's a computational biologist. This paper was rejected for publication because it was, quote, fascinating but dangerous, because we got into some questions about these very things. For example, what might be an advantageous institution in one scenario, say a scenario of scarcity, that allows one group to do well, that in a contemporary scenario would read as a moral scenario of, say, racism or othering, right? So you might get this trajectory that is very much about survival of a group, and management of a resource vis-a-vis another group, and it might be about exclusion or warfare or all these things. How do you treat this other group? And if that institution persists, well, then today you end up with, racism or gender norms about who does what work, right? So there's absolutely a dynamic that the degree of the moral quality of it, how much of it is a desert statement and what we consider a moral issue versus a pragmatic issue of, look, there's this much food and we're dividing people on this basis for no good reason other than sometimes you got, I don't know what it was like to be an ancient hunter-gatherer or an ancient, whatever, but some of these divisions were hit upon. So to your question, let's imagine a scenario, and I talk about this in that paper with Madamasetti, which you can find on ARVIX or whatever that's called. imagine a scenario where, there's an upstream downstream situation, and just by chance, so there's two rivers, and let's say group A is at the top and group B is downstream. In this river over here on my left, the downstream group just hit upon the fact they tried a lot of things, and what started to work for them was when they started doing a gift giving thing to the upstream culture to make sure the water kept flowing, right? Over here on the right stream, the downstream culture maybe tried a bunch of different things, just whatever they could to make sure that water kept flowing. And the first thing that worked was they threatened them, or they went to they actually did a minor incursion and kind of had a small warfare thing with them. Over time, if those institutions settle, and this group kind of gives a yearly tribute, this group kind of constantly threatens, the people who live in those societies, there's a very good chance, if you've always had the water flowing and you don't really know, why is it we always send this tribute upstream, or why is it we always are fighting with these guys? You as somebody who's grown up in the society has always seen that water run. You don't really know that institution, this kind of general aggression, or this kind of general subservience and kind of friendliness started to specifically around this idea of maybe water flow. But now it's affected your whole society potentially. We are a friendly society. We get along with our neighbors. Works just as well for governing a water system as we are an unfriendly society. We go to war with people, So the evolutionary dynamic of this has a big issue. And I'd say how we need to study this is, one, we need to look at myths and kind of what are the general characteristics? What are the general fables and kind of virtues that a society or a group puts in their stories? So I think this has a lot to talk to people who do narrative policy analysis, narrative policy framework. And they need to get in those stories and, how do we define ourselves? Are we a friendly people? Are we a mistrustful people? Yeah, and these things will take on, they were started as a very pragmatic issue, right? We just need to solve this problem. They might then spread and spill over into other areas. And you will never know why they originated that. You just know that your mom told you, those people up there, we don't trust them. Or, is that kind of getting to the dynamic issue that you're discussing? I'm sure there's a game theoretic answer here too. But I gave up after 2 years of Mike McGinnis trying to get me to understand game theory. And I understand it well enough, but Mike's like, you know what? Stick to this stuff. So.
Thank you.
Any other questions?
So can I just follow up then? So Jacob, is the way to get at this to basically, leverage sort of a mixed methods approach where we look if we're using policy, for example, as the basis for thinking about how kind of policy benefits and burdens are allocated.
Mm-hmm.
If you consider like sanctioning, for example,
Mm-hmm.
as one form of burden.
Sorry.
Something you had mentioned earlier struck me about this, that if we think, are people really deserving of this particular sanction?
Mm-hmm.
And then sort of couple that with another data collection methods to basically get people's perceptions on this and their sense of fairness, not just, Is this how you suggest kind of getting at these sorts of things?
Yeah, for someone who doesn't have patience like me, measuring it via survey is always going to be easy. And you can do it with some obvious things. It's not just about economic outcomes, right?
Mm-hmm.
What makes someone deserving of being put to death is a very obvious kind of one. What makes someone deserving of being a local alderman? Or, just like, again, it's not just bad things or good things, right? It's even responsibilities and, okay, Kat, come on. It's any number of these things, and you can just put that in a stupid survey, and just have people do it. And actually, there's a role here for experimental economics, and I've done a couple experimental economics pieces, and you can study people in game and how they come to these understandings of desert. If you are a smarter person than me and have the patience to do it, I think field work is the way to do it, or even textual analysis. And I'm not kidding when it comes to norms and fables, especially where there's still a robust field of this. So actually, there's a guy, an old buddy of mine. I think he's now at Berkeley because he's a successful academic, and he studies he studies specifically like anti-Semitic sentiment in Germany, Semitic character, and so these fables clearly have implications today. And then he compares that to rates on like how many Jews were saved in World War II. where these different fables existed. You know, how many were gotten out of Germany. I mean, so textual analysis of these mythos things, I think, is something that there's a lot of room for. So it doesn't just have to be what are people talking about today. And I think even pop culture probably would tell you a lot. You know, as we have increasingly, you know, segmented markets appealing to the African American market. You know, there's a whole dating service just for farmers now. You know, I don't know. But yes, mixed methods is the way to go, I think. And if you're a quant person like me, a survey is invaluable, as are experimental economics. What I don't see and what I'd love to see is more of this sociological and contextual research.
Okay, we have time for one more question. Kimberly?
Right. Okay. So thank you for this. So I'm a PhD candidate at Boulder, and for my dissertation, I've been looking at the treatment of equality in village governance institutions in India. And what I am discovering is that people think about equality differently. And I had been trying to think about this more like in different value framework, value systems, but this framework of desert, I think, applies so well. Because it's not that people don't value equality, it's their thoughts on who was deserving differs. So I guess my question is, so there is kind of a the question, I guess, is about changing the concept of desertness and your thought on that, because, you know, in kind of like an evolutionary, we derive these cultural understanding of desert, and maybe they're outdated or they don't suit the current context. And like I'm working with an NGO that tries to introduce different thinkings about equality and distribution, so that local communities can like better manage their commons better, or, you know, better work together. But what are your thoughts, besides capturing people's understanding of desert?
So what I think we need to do is it's about, and this is why I think it's great, getting away from like just broad terms like fairness and justice. What desert does is it forces you to specify the bases. And what happens a lot with equality is the bases are unspoken and assumed. So for example, if you were to write a freedom from torture, like, you know, the UN freedom from torture, we all deserve an equal amount of freedom from torture, okay? Now, if you're an animal rights advocate, you'd say, well, this is insufficient. You know, it's not just your humanness. You know, the desert basis for freedom from torture in the UN Convention is that you're a human. That's the desert basis. It's not spoken. It's just said it's an equality thing. We all deserve a freedom from torture. I might believe that no, the desert bases are actually about sentience and ability to feel pain. And so if those are my desert bases, it's no longer about humanness. It's about, you know, suddenly great apes might be included in this and all sorts of other things. Now, this also has a dark side. And I suggest, you know, I think I mentioned briefly Doug Hofstadter's I Am a Strange Loop. This idea of consciousness. There is this question of what counts as you could debate that there are different levels of humanness, right? What counts as an I, a capital I, you know, and this comes into questions of cognizance, intelligence. You know, we can say that we're all equal humans, and yet we all have very different capabilities and capacities, physical, mental. And so that can be a very uncomfortable question, you know, and in fact, some cultures will not describe or define people who we would call people, because the desert basis isn't, are they a human species, but are they like a fully physically functioning human species? So, you know, people with disabilities are often not afforded rights, because equality is not about personhood. It's about physical capacity, cognitive capacity, all these other things. So it gets into some dicey territory, certainly for people in the West. But so what I'm encouraging you to do is think about the specific bases of desert, and that with equality, they're almost always unspoken. It's assumed that it's about personhood, but it's often also about gender, contribution to society. So we need to start specifying those things. Yeah, like, do animals have rights? Do they deserve certain things? If your bases are about sentience or the ability to feel pain, they do. And so the equal protection from torture shouldn't just be extended to humans. Is that a little bit helpful? Get to those bases.
Very helpful.
We are out of time. Thank you, Jacob, for your presentation.